Oh, hello my friends, hope you are well. Today I wanted to whip up a bit of a spooky fantasy diorama using some more of my leftover Age of Sigmar miniatures, and the backstory for this build is that of an unfortunate Stormcast Eternal being caught off guard in an ancient tomb, suspended by some spectrally restraints and staring down the axe of a mighty ghostly foe. This is how it came out, and this, my friends, is how I did it.
Swamp Rat Miniatures.
So I've just got my usual kind of foam and plasticard base here I've whipped up beforehand, and I'm going to get things started by adding some flooring down. I have this kind of graveyard tile piece left over from a scenery set I got a while ago which will fit the base well, but I first cut out this middle raised section so it wouldn't obscure any of the details I'll add later. I filed down the stone pieces around the edges to give them more of a natural finish, and then secured it in place with a squelch of hot glue. Next up, I needed a wall piece for the back of the diorama, and this one looked perfect, except it was slightly too wide for the size of base I'd built. So I made some delicate surgical incisions in order to remove these pillars on the sides, clean them up a bit, and then reattach them so they'd overlap with the existing wall slightly and reduce its overall width. I used some pliers to rough up the top of the wall to give it more of an ancient ruined look, and then plug the gaps between our newly adjusted wall ends with some worms of green stuff. Another little squirt of hot glue and our wall was sitting pretty. The last kind of important detail I wanted to do was fill in the empty space in the middle of the build, so I cut out this little burial grave thing and trimmed down the edges so it'd fit the gap nicely. I then went into full World War I simulator mode and dug out a trench for the grave to sit in and used more of that sticky sauce to make sure it won't run away. And I quite like this detail because usually I'm layering up details on top of the base, so it was a fun change of pace to sink something below the surface instead. Anyway, on to our miniatures. For the build I have in mind, I needed to make some adjustments to this Stormcast miniature so he looks like he's actually suspended in midair against the wall and not just standing in generic fantasy battle pose 6. So I started by removing all his limbs first, which left him looking like a headless version of the guy from the one video by Metallica, and after a touch of cleanup work to smooth those edges, I began reattaching the limbs to fit the pose I was envisioning. I attached his arms into a spread eagle T pose, having them pull back slightly to give the impression they were being stretched out by his magical restraints, and don't mind the hole in this shield. I might have gone a bit too far with my adjustments to help fit the miniature to the wall, but we can fix that later. Next up, I changed the left leg position dramatically by just tucking it in slightly more than it was originally, and then re-added the right leg kind of pointing downward with the foot angle to amplify this effect and add to the impression of him being suspended in the air. After a few adjustments to the collar area, I attached his head with it being pointed upwards like he's crying out in pain or straining against his ghostly ties, and you probably noticed that I've just been attaching the limbs roughly using some super glue. So now that they were all in the correct position, I used some green stuff to fill the gaps and re-establish those pieces of armor I'd cut away earlier, and also filled in that hole I'd made with the shield. And here is our final Stormcast pose, my friends. I'm quite pleased with this actually. I think it does work well with the arms stretched out, legs dangling and head thrown back in pain, so to me at least it's given the desired effect of a mid-air restraint by some malevolent ghostly forces, and to finish him off I just needed to add the actual restraints themselves. This was really quick to accomplish, as all I did was drill away a hole between the arm and the shield here, loop some floral wire through it and around the wrist, leaving an offshoot coming off to one side which could be pulled on by the ghost. I'd wrap the other wrist up also, and then I simply glued our miniature to the centre of the wall with our wire offshoot sticking out to either side. Boom shakalaka, that is looking pretty good to me. The idea for the wires is that will be some kind of magical tether spawned by the ghost to hold the unfortunate Stormcast in place. So now we have the spawny, we need the spawners. On to the ghosts. I've got a couple of these chain rasps that I decided would be suitable for our purposes today, but the hands needed some alterations so they'd work with the magical tethers we just added. To get them compatible, I took some leftover arms, I think these were from some crypt ghouls or something like that, chopped off whatever bone related objects they were holding onto, and then drilled a hole through the closed hand to slot the wire into. I removed their previous arms at the elbow, then glued on the new ones, posing them in a way that would look like they were pulling on the tethers once finished, to add to the dynamic look of the scene, and then just chopped away some more of the wall with my pliers so I could glue them on without them sticking out too awkwardly. For our big juicy ghost, all I did was chop off whatever this was supposed to be, some kind of candelabra thing maybe, and then cut away and drilled out the bottom of an orc axe before lovingly joining the pieces together in holy matrimony. Easy peasy, and this looks a bit more menacing than that weird bulbous pole, which is also how I would describe my I was feeling pretty happy with the miniatures at this point, but I felt like the diorama needed a bit more pizzazz, so I added some of my homemade mud mixture onto any of the exposed areas of foam, then scattered on some pebbly basin mixture and some sand, and finally chucked on a whole bunch of these little chains I'd extracted from some unwanted jewellery. So this is our finished build before priming, this is it after priming, and we are now ready for painting. I'm starting off with the scenery, and the paint job for this was really quick and simple, as I'd used a few little cheaty methods which I'll show you in a minute. To begin with though, all I did was dry brush on some progressively lighter coats of grey to all of the stonework, ending with a final small amount of an off-white colour, and then painted in the other details like the skulls, the skeleton in the grave, and all the chains scattered about the place. Then for cheat number 1, the whole piece got a coating with some streaking grime, which was a bit of an experiment as I haven't used this with scenery yet and wanted to see how it would work. And hold on to your horses because it works pretty well. Once I take away the excess using some white spirit to reveal what's underneath, we've got some lovely weathered and dirty old stonework for no significant time or effort invested, which is pretty good stuff. For cheat number 2, I used some dirty down moss to build up some mossy growth along the bottom edges of the wall where it'd be nice and damp. Again, super quick and easy to add and gives a pretty realistic looking result when dried. For cheat number 3, I've got the dirty down moss's brother, the dirty down rust, and I'm applying some of this to age up all of the metallic details and help them look a bit more natural in our old tomb setting. And lastly, maybe not as much of a cheat as the last steps, but we'll call it cheat number 4 no less, using some Nuln Ore to reinforce the separation between the different sections of the wall and the stones on the floor. So there we go, this whole scenery paint job probably took me like an hour maybe, including drying times, which is pretty crazy. And I know there are some hobby purists out there that don't really approve of these products and would insist on building up the same effect using multiple layers of acrylic paints or washes and pigments or whatever else, but for me, if it looks good and it saves time, then I'm all for it. For our Stormcast, however, I don't really have any cheats for you today, and I was debating whether I should try and go for some really fancy looking non-metallic metal paint job to blow you all away, but to be honest, I'm nowhere near good enough for that at the moment. My non-metallic metal looks more like a non-identifiable paint smudge, so we're going to go with the true metallics instead today. After adding a base coat with a darker metallic colour, I was layering up some brighter ones on top of that to add to the sheen, and then I did something I've not really tried before, which was glazing on some thin layers of black into the shadow areas to really get those metals popping. I use washes with metallics, but adding this more specifically targeted glazes in the shadow areas really made everything pop a lot more, and I'm sure the more experienced painters out there are like, what are you talking about, you dingus? But this was an exciting discovery for me, and I'm going to be playing around with this a lot more in the near future to finesse my true metallic painting schemes more. Anyway, back to the current paint job. I used a dark purple as an accessory colour on the pauldrons and the tabard at the front, then began building up some highlights with some layers of stippling. These highlights ended up looking a bit too pink though, so I thinned down a darker purple into a kind of glazed consistency and used this to blend the layers together and darken down that pink into something closer to the original colour. Next, I painted in the leathery details with a quick and dirty leathery effect, which looked okay, not spectacular, but better than a slap in the balls. Then I hit the metallic details on the scabbard with some gold, painted the little mini scrolly tabard thing here on the side. I'm not sure what these are actually called, so let me know in the comments if you know what they are. And then I painted the metallic details on the scabbard all over again, but in silver this time because the gold looked really awful with everything else. Finally, I painted the gem on his belt in a nice dark red colour like a big old round ruby, and I felt like this really helped to tie everything together. So all in all, I was quite pleased with this guy actually. Some spots were a bit messier than I'd have liked, but in that way it's a good representation of my own personal life, so I'm happy with it, and it's time for our ghosts. Our small boy ghosts were getting the same paint job as our big boy ghost, and this was another simple one to be honest, you know. I wanted them to have a nice spectrally glowing green colour for the bottom row bits, so I started off with a kind of minty teal colour for the base coat, then progressed through some different layers where I'd mixed in some brighter greens, then finished it all off with a final layer where I'd blended in some quite pale yellow for a kind of final highlight. I started the upper road part with a dark stone colour, which is somewhere between a brown and a grey, and also laid up some quick volumetric highlights on the raised areas using a slightly lightened blend of this colour. I added a dirty little edge highlight on the ruffles and around any visible scenes. I wasn't sure if this colour scheme was going to work with the green, but in the end I quite liked how it looked, so I didn't need to paint over it all, luckily. The arms and faces got a quick touching in with some bony colours, just a quick bog standard base coat, wash and highlight procedure to give them some flavour, and then to finish off the miniatures themselves, I just painted in any chains and shackles and bells and what other metallic details they had, and added a splash more of that dirty down rust here to help blend them in with the other chains scattered around the floor of our tomb. And now, the moment I'd been kind of excited for but also really dreading because I wasn't sure how it'd turn out. It was time to add an OSL effect to the spectral restraints holding our Stormcast in place. I'm about as far from being a master OSL practitioner as you can get. I'm barely a novice in this area really, so I didn't do any fancy undershading or preparation for the brighter colours as I was painting the previous areas of the miniatures or scenery. I basically just dry brushed on different layers of those spectrally green colours I'd use for the ghosts. I started by dry brushing that minty teal colour quite widely behind the spectral tethers. I don't really know what I'm calling these things at the moment. Spooky string, roptoplasm, who knows, who cares? But yeah, adding quite a wide dry brush with a darker colour, then dry brushing a progressively narrower colour with each coat until I finally reached my brightest greeny yellow colour, which I only used on the immediate areas around the road to imply the light is diminishing as it gets further away from the light source. I use a brush to tidy up some of the dry brush work and try to blend the areas together a bit better, and I won't lie to you, it's not the tidiest. You could search miniature painting OSL effects on YouTube right now and find a million better effects than the one I've done today. But I quite like it and it was fun to do. So all that's left now is to add our big ghosty boy in place, give him a quick and dirty OSL effect as well, and see how everything turned out. So my friends, what do you think? I think this whole diorama could probably be summed up as being a little bit rough around the edges in some places, but coming together to make a pretty good looking final product. I think this build is a good example of the sum being greater than the parts, and there were a few times I was considering scrapping it, but I really like how it looks now at the end. As I mentioned earlier, the glazing of black layers in the shadowed areas on the metallic armor was a really good discovery for me. I'm a bit single-minded, so in the past, while I'd still use washes for metallics, my brain is like, you're using metallic paints, so you can only use other metallics on top of that. I would never really paint a matte acrylic paint on top of it to accentuate it, but I will definitely be doing more of this, and I'm going to be playing around with this in the future so I can finesse this technique and find the best way of making my true metallics pop. The OSL effect we did was also quite basic and a little bit rough and ready, but again, I was quite pleased with this. I've only really done very small basic OSL effects coming from lights or like a plasma gun or something like that previously, so it was a good step up for me to commit to a much larger OSL effect on a build like this, and I now feel more confident to experiment with this and refine my technique more in the future. So all in all, this was a great build for me. I tried out some things I don't normally do and they were far from perfect, but I'm now feeling more positive about developing my abilities with them in the future, and I think that's the most important thing with this hobby. You try things, they suck at first, but the more you do it, the better you get. If you enjoyed this video, then please subscribe or leave a like or a comment, let me know what your favourite or least favourite part was and what you got for Christmas. And for now, as always, I have been your friendly neighbourhood swamp rat, and I will see you very soon in another video. See ya.